Welcome to Resolutions, the official podcast of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. Every episode is a journey into the heart of conflict resolution, guided by our diverse community of experts. We're here to explore innovative strategies, share wisdom from the field, and inspire excellence in resolving disputes. Whether you're a dispute resolution professional, a curious learner, or someone passionate about fostering understanding and peace, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's conversation and discover how we can transform conflict into opportunity together.
I'm your host, Aaron Gothelf. This week I'm sitting with lawyer, mediator, and author Ronda Muir to discuss her latest book, Beyond Smart: Lawyering with Emotional Intelligence. Ronda is one of the country's leading authorities on lawyer personalities and the use of behavioral science in the practice of law. Drawing from her own experiences working in big law, both in New York and Europe, as well as working in-house, Ronda offers business-savvy, psychologically sophisticated, real-world solutions to traditional and emerging challenges unique to the legal industry and its professionals. Ronda's book, Beyond Smart: Lawyering with Emotional Intelligence, is the first and only comprehensive guide to understanding, using, and raising your emotional intelligence in the practice of law. The recently released second edition reflects breaking research, addressing, among other things, increased disengagement, the fallout from the COVID pandemic, and the advantages that emotional intelligence brings to 21st century lawyers in legal workplaces. Welcome, Ronda.
Thank you, Aaron. Happy to be here.
Okay. Before we start, I should mention Ronda's book is available for purchase through the ABA website, and proceeds from the sale do benefit the dispute resolution section, so you're going to want to check that out. If you purchase your book before August 31st, 2025, and enter code, and I'll read this a couple times, BSL2D20, you'll receive a 20% discount on your purchase. And again, that is B as in boy, S as in Sam, L as in Larry, the number 2, D as in dog, the number 20. Enter that code and you'll get your 20% discount. All right. Okay. So I enjoyed reading your book. Thank you so much. Or I guess I should thank the ABA for sending me a free copy of it. I believe most people have heard of the concept of emotional intelligence, but how do you define emotional intelligence just on a very basic level?
Well, it's a compound noun to start out with. So we're talking about combining emotions and cognitive intelligence. And that's what the point of emotional intelligence is to draw data from both of those areas. But the short answer is emotional intelligence is the ability to make your emotions work for you. There's no good or bad. It's just whatever facilitates what you're trying to, it facilitates what you're trying to do. So there's no moral aspect to emotional intelligence, and it doesn't mean you're kind or soft or anything like that. It just means you can use that emotional daily data in your working life.
And I think that's important to note that people think that people with high EQs, I guess what we're abbreviating emotional intelligence there, might be, it's not a psychological term, but more of a touchy feeling or genuine type person necessarily. But emotional intelligence can actually be used for bad things as well, right?
Yes, and in fact, there are psychopaths that have emotional intelligence skills. So we're not you can't load any kind of moral attribute into emotional intelligence.
Yeah, it's not a podcast episode on serial killers or anything like that, but I'd actually be really interested to see maybe many of them actually have very high emotional intelligence scores. So
yeah, of the 4 skills that we can talk about, they're usually high in a couple of them. So that's interesting in talking about emotional intelligence.
All right. So while the general public often sees lawyers displaying a lack of emotional intelligence, are lawyers any less emotionally intelligent than the general public, or is this a misconception? And I take this from people seeing lawyers on TV shows or in movies, and oftentimes lawyers are yelling at each other. I mean, I know a lot of this is kind of Hollywood magic and all that kind of stuff, but anybody who's worked in the legal profession for a number of years has probably had some bad interactions with opposing counsel and whatnot, and questioned really the emotional intelligence of some of the folks on the other side. But go ahead.
Yes, there's some interesting data on that actually from the ABA. the more a person is involved with the legal system, the less they think of it and its professionals. So there's to back that up, that comment you made. But there are no real definitive large-scale studies on lawyers' emotional intelligence, but there are small ones that control for profession, like lawyers, and are sort of competitive professions like surgeons, doctors, accountants. And unfortunately, lawyers on average, and that's really important, is the on average part, have a lower level of emotional intelligence than those other professionals.
Okay, well, that's upsetting to hear.
So it can show up, with what it means. It definitely also comes across as having a lower emotional intelligence than the general public. So what that means is people like your staff and your witnesses and your other non-lawyer, as we call them, people that you interact with may very well have higher emotional intelligence than you do.
So getting back to again like perceptions of attorneys and starting in law school all through our legal careers, especially if we're litigators, aggression, winning in court, winning in negotiations, whatnot, are seen as very important qualities with an attorney. Nobody would want to hire an attorney that's going to go in there and lose, right? Do you think in the legal profession, and coming from your background, because you've worked in big law, which is, kind of singled out for some of these issues, is emotional intelligence viewed as a sign of weakness in the legal industry? And, with for example, bet the farm, high stakes types of litigation, right? Would an emotionally intelligent lawyer be viewed as a weaker adversary?
Well, I don't know how much these days emotional intelligence as a term is sort of batted around in the legal field amongst colleagues, but certainly no lawyer wants to be seen as soft by their clients. I mean, they want to, the perception is of the meanest lawyer who will ultimately more or less bully their client is the one that's going to be the most, their client and their opposition is going to be the one that's most successful. So you have to sort of worry about this perception of being soft. But the data doesn't bear that out. In fact, Randy Kaiser, who is a decision set, he's done a whole lot of studies, including several books on very high stakes litigation, primarily for the insurance industry, but for other industries as well. And he has made it very clear that the social skills, the soft skills, as we might call them, emotional intelligence, is what actually is the defining difference in the winningest litigators and those who are not.
So when I obviously I speak a lot about mediation and arbitration. And
Mm.
mediation and arbitration are two completely different things, and in my opinion, involve very different skill sets. I like to think of mediation as a bit of an art form, right? We all know people that just have this unique ability, this innate ability within them, maybe from the time that they're born, to resolve disputes. And it doesn't matter what type of dispute it is, they just have this ability. As opposed to when arbitration, I think is more of a skill that you can learn. It's based on your practice area, it's based on understanding case and procedure and all that, whatnot. So along those lines, can emotional intelligence be learned, or is it something that you're primarily born with?
There's not total agreement on that. But there is total agreement that if it's not genetic, it can be learned. So we have one of the primary researchers who came up with the concept of emotional intelligence, John Mayer, who was at the University of New Hampshire. He believes that it's not genetic. There are many other researchers, theorists who believe that there's a strong genetic component, but all of them agree that it's improvable. Your scores in emotional intelligence, your abilities in emotional intelligence can improve over time with learning. So that's the really important piece there.
Yeah. And then, I guess along those lines, what do you think? And you touched on this in the book a bit. What are the business advantages of being an emotionally intelligent lawyer? And I guess, when I say business advantages, you look at business a couple different types of ways. Obviously, being a better attorney. I guess if you're a litigator, that means winning cases, right? Or getting good settlements for your clients. But also from a business point of view, in the fee for service, billable hour world of a law firm, right? If you want to bill more hours, if you bill more hours for the firm makes more money. Probably you make more money somehow. So can you speak to that?
Yes, there's, two parts of that, like you're saying. There's sort of the individual performance. For example, better decision making, better ability to get and keep clients, better emotional health, better able to deal with stress, better able to avoid burnout. Those are sort of the advantages to an emotionally intelligent lawyer individually. But there are also a lot of advantages to a firm that values and it promotes emotional intelligence because we know that they have lower attrition. They also, again, generally better productivity, better decision making at a management standpoint, much better leadership, which is really important, lower liability because you have more emotionally and mentally healthy lawyers, and just greater well-being generally. So there's both personal advantages to the individual lawyers, and then there are firm or department or organizational advantages too.
We talk about how the legal industry in particular, I think, has one of the highest rates of attrition of any profession. People are always saying, do we really need 200 plus law schools in the United States, like that are just churning out thousands of attorneys a year? And what I would say is so many people leave the legal profession 2, 3, 4 years after graduating from law school, but that's how a lot of these law schools stay in business. And I think there's been lots of studies on it's way more costly to a company or a firm dealing with the attrition issue than even, let's say, having an attorney that's underperforming and somebody you might be able to help. So people like to be around people that are in a good mood and I guess have a high degree of emotional intelligence. So it's not just better for the person with the high EQ, but better for everybody that's practicing around them.
Very true. And not only is it because that individual is sort of emotionally better, but that person contributes to firm or organizational mood. And we know that those moods are contagious. So the higher level of productivity, higher level of good moods is going to produce a better firm, a better, more productive firm.
And then along those lines, how does a high level of emotional intelligence make somebody a better negotiator? And I would add on top of that question, I think there are some people in the legal profession that think having a high EQ does not necessarily make you a better negotiator because you might be more likely to give in to the demands of the other side. But can you dispel that myth and kind of explain how your book centered on that?
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding, in my opinion. But wherever there's a conflict, there's going to be high emotions. That's just inevitable. There's both the high emotions between the parties, and then there's the high emotions which are often not recognized within the negotiators. They have their own anxiety and anger and concerns. And Felix Rohatyn, who was one of the great, negotiating barons of a lot of different deals, said that he thought that most deals were 50% emotions and 50% economics. So that sort of gives you an idea of how critical some of these emotional issues are in these negotiations. Some negotiators have pointed out how frequently lawyers come to the negotiating table without realizing their own emotional biases and perceptions and concerns. And often, as this one person said, particularly amongst lawyers, they tend to be so uncomfortable with those emotions that come up, they just try to block them and try to be totally rational. But it doesn't change the fact that those emotions around anxiety about whether they can get the deal they want, whether they're going to please the client, whether they're going to be able to win over this other negotiator, it's going to have an impact. And if it comes through as defensiveness or as blocking what emotional info you can get, it's going to reduce your likelihood of being effective.
You touch on this in the book. How are law firms and in-house legal departments using emotional intelligence to strengthen their organizations? And I guess that flows into the next question is you discuss the 4 steps to achieving emotionally intelligent workplace in your book. Could you discuss those steps? And then we'll discuss a little bit later how COVID has impacted those changes.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that law firms and law departments, I mean, law departments are usually a little better about this because their corporate offices are more attuned to this generally, productivity, better decision making, better congeniality, that sort of thing. So corporate departments, but it's not often targeted towards lawyers. It's targeted toward the general corporate environment. I can't say that law firms are great at this. I mean, usually there's in their trainings for business development or maybe ethics, or maybe they have some component of leadership where they touch on some of these concepts, but they often don't have truly an emotional intelligence development program. The other place that sometimes it comes up is we have such great data on how important the emotional component of a team is. And sometimes law firms and law departments will have some awareness of that because Google did a lot of research to figure out how to put together the best, most efficient, smartest team. And it wasn't based on IQ, it wasn't based on diversity, it wasn't any of that stuff. It was based on whether or not the members of that team could make each other feel emotionally safe. So if they were emotionally safe, they could give feedback, throw out ideas, they could say things that other team members in other teams couldn't because they didn't feel emotionally safe. So there you have a very important part of recognizing emotions, being empathic and attentive and that sort of thing. But you don't see that. Firms sometimes don't realize, or departments don't realize why their teams are working or not working, but that's a very important part.
So with COVID, your book, I guess the second edition here was written post-COVID. So you had a little bit of experience studying engagement and disengagement and how COVID has impacted law firms and workplaces and emotional intelligence in general. COVID changed the way we work, how we do business. All of a sudden, we went from getting up in the morning and slapping on a suit and driving off to an office and seeing coworkers in person and having in-person conversations and kind of that congeniality and all that to in some parts of this country for 2 or 3 years we didn't see anybody at least in person. So can you speak to kind of how it's changed and how emotional intelligence was impacted by the pandemic?
Well, the bad news is that the general level of emotional intelligence in the United States went down during COVID. I mean, you can sort of understand why that would be. We got less social feedback. We were less involved socially. We were more isolated. We were more anxious. You can sort of go down the list, and that would show stress was up. So COVID, as a general matter, hurt working people generally and lawyers specifically. I mean, we have good data on lawyers that their anxiety, their health, all of that went down. Anxiety went up, health went down during COVID. So that was not good. What I did want to touch on before we get too far into COVID is the four steps that we didn't talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
really
Go
that
ahead.
law firms can take. Make sure I have that in.
And those are along the lines of the four components of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, well, there's two pieces. The four
Two pieces.
components of emotional intelligence are the perception of emotions, emotional empathy, emotional management, and emotional regulation, actually regulation and management. But the important part of those four components is emotional perception is at the bottom of a pyramid that all the other skills rest on.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that one at the bottom, emotional perception or identification, being able to tell what you're feeling or other people are feeling, is the one that lawyers are worse at.
Mhm.
But there are some steps that law firms can take. I say you have to start at the top. And the issue there is that top management in most organizations are the least emotionally intelligent. The
Hmm.
middle management tends to be the most emotionally intelligent. Top management, so in law firms, that's, probably your executive committee. And the reason that's true is because they're insulated from feedback because they have a lot of yes people promoting them around them. And unfortunately, they don't ask for feedback. Sort of the higher up you get on the totem pole, it appears of the data we have is that they're less likely to ask for feedback. So they're less emotionally aware. So that's a problem. That's why I said we have to start at the top. The other reason we start at the top is there's good data that hierarchy impacts emotional contagion. So that the people highest in the hierarchy are the ones that project their emotions. Some people have called it they're like an emotional thermostat for an organization. The power of their hierarchy projects their emotions throughout the organization. So if that's anxiety or anger or all those, that's what's going to get hyped up within the organization. So it's very important that the person at the top or the people at the top are able to emote to their organization. So you start at the top. That's step one. The second one is you try to hire emotionally intelligent professionals. Now, that's a trick, and I admit it. But there are other countries, for example, the UK, that have emotional intelligence screening before they hire lawyers. It doesn't have to be extensive. It shouldn't have a lot of, there's no bad results, really. There's just differing levels, different aspects, different skills. But you can also do in the United States, you can do behavioral interviewing. There are some firms that as soon as they hire, they do emotional intelligence testing so that they know where to help place these people, how to make them successful, what areas they would be best at. So I definitely think that hiring, and then of course developing as the third step, is really important. You've got to develop emotional intelligence. And that means the sort of training we talked about, business development, leadership, and that sort of thing. But if you have an effective feedback system, whatever that is, it should include feedback on things. It should show that within the firm or the organization that emotionally intelligent skills are important and they get noticed and they get feedback, etc. And the last step I had for that is that you want to, for those emotional intelligence people, for those people you want to keep, you want to make sure that you're inspiring them using emotional intelligent concepts. The purpose of the firm, the purpose of the reason they're connected, which is we have very good data that being emotionally connected to a group or to a firm is a much stronger tie than even high compensation. So you want to make sure that these people feel emotionally connected, that they're inspired, that they feel like they have a purpose, that they feel like they're included. And that's the fourth step, in my opinion, to developing an emotionally intelligent workplace.
So just a couple of points that I wanted to touch on from that. First of all, it's kind of ironic that the people at the top might display the lowest level of emotional intelligence, yet the middle management layer right below them has the most, considering that most people at the top had to come through that kind of middle management level, and it's almost as if they've kind of forgotten all of their emotional intelligence. And one thing that I saw that I thought was interesting is Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all these people, they conduct meetings in different ways, and they all have strong opinions about how a meeting should be conducted. But I believe it was Bezos that said at Amazon, the most junior people at the meeting speak first, and you kind of go in reverse direction up the line because he doesn't want the seniors
Mhm.
speaking first and then a whole bunch of yes people underneath them giving basically just the same opinion and agreeing with it. So that's, I think, a good hack, or I guess a good emotional intelligence hack to get a better feedback from your organization as a whole,
Right,
and B, to really inspire some of your more junior people to kind of grow with the position.
right.
You touched on hiring for emotional intelligence and kind of how one goes about that. I know that they have all these different self-assessment tests that one might take, a Myers-Briggs type thing or whatnot. Can we train interviewers though to really spot emotional intelligence and kind of what are some of the things that a human being could do? I know we're talking these days about using AI for this and AI for that, and there's probably an awful lot of AI in hiring and maybe even interviewing, but where's the human component there?
There are companies who hire and interview and who monitor, like we have data on call banks, where they're doing customer service calls, but they monitor AI monitors that gives them prompts and help and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Behavioral interviewing is sort of, I mean, your best without actually giving people tests for the firm or the organization is their best bet, behavioral interviewing, where you actually have a set of questions that are geared towards illuminating whether they have self-awareness, Obviously everything, what's your weakness? What weakness do you have? And if they say I just work too hard then you're sort of
All
thinking,
these pre-canned answers. I've
yeah,
read them all.
you're thinking, I don't know about
I
that.
care too much.
Care too much,
Right.
exactly. That's my weakness. So, there's a list of things, giving an example of a case where you worked with other people in your organization to overcome an issue or to solve a problem. And what do you think are, your greatest opportunities? What are the things you need to work on? I mean, that just self-awareness is such a critical opening to emotional intelligence. Again, that perception piece, if you can't, if you're not aware, you're not going to get anywhere. So finding people who can articulate an awareness of emotional situations and how to handle them is important. And depends on exactly the firm too. I mean, so I've worked with firms that are looking for a particular type of profile. So that the behavioral interviewing can be different for that firm than it might be for another firm.
Yeah. Yeah. How does one assess their own emotional intelligence? And I mean, you go over a couple of different tests and stuff like that in the book that might be good. Do people need to test themselves or ask a friend? Like, do a behavioral interview analysis of myself or something.
Stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot, and I give a list of them in the book. There's a lot of sort of online free things that will ask you a bunch of questions and that will give you an idea. It give you an idea. They won't like make you go too far off course. There are three sort of well-known, the Mesquite, which was the assessment that was developed. These cost money and
Hmm.
maybe would involve some interpretation, but the Mesquite was developed by the three psychology professors who developed the concept of emotional intelligence back in 1995. I like it the best. It's called an ability assessment. It's like an SAT. It doesn't tell you what you do, it tells you what you're capable of. So I like it. It's good to coach to. But there's also something called the EQI-2, which is Reuven Bar-On, an Israeli psychologist who's a well-known assessment. And then Goldman worked with the Hayes group to develop an assessment. It's called the ESCI. So those three cost money, are lengthier. I mean, 30, 40 minutes. But there's a lot of stuff you can take online that are simple and that'll give you again, some self-awareness. And of course, like you said, it may be hard to hear or it may be hard for others to deliver, but if you can ask questions of the people around you who you work with, what's any idea what I should be working on, or what would you recommend I do differently, or something like that? Not you don't have to be self-effacing or self-bashing, but people who know you probably have some ideas too.
What's the best way to raise your own emotional intelligence? And I was just, going through your book. It mentions coaches, mentors, even emotional intelligence buddies. I got that directly out of the book. Is this also something that psychologists and psychiatrists do? Should I ask my family and friends to help in the process? What's the best way for me myself to go about it?
Yeah, I certainly think that the same thing therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists do, working on creating more self-awareness. Again, working on how do I do things? Why do I do things? What might be a better way to respond? Certainly, that side of therapeutic help is always helpful. Coaches are great because usually they have a pretty good understanding of emotional intelligence skills. Mentors depend on who the mentors are. If you're going to have a mentor help you, make sure it's a mentor who has those skills, who you think has those skills, because you have a lot of lawyers mentoring in law firms who are given the job of mentors because they're not doing enough billable hours, or something like that. That's not really the person, that's not the standard you want for the person mentoring you. You want someone who's actually good at this. And so by emotional intelligence buddy, that could be a colleague. That could be someone who you see seems to be able to diffuse conflicts, seems to be able to bring people together on an issue, seems to get along with most people. That could be someone in the firm, but it might be someone in another firm, or it might be a spouse, for example, who's someone who's not a lawyer at all, but who, if you give them a scenario, can give you, who you think gives good advice. So an emotional intelligence buddy is just someone who you have some confidence will give you a straight answer to your questions about some scenario.
And your point's well taken. It shouldn't always just be your supervisor or your boss or the highest person up in any organization, those folks might not be exactly the best people to help you with your emotional intelligence because they themselves maybe lack emotional intelligence.
I would go into firms and I would say, sort trying to find out like who in this firm has high emotional intelligence. And so I'd say like, who's the person that associates go to with their personal problems? Who's the associates, who's the lawyer associates go to if they have sort of an inner workings issue or if they have a problem with somebody? It's often like not senior management. It's often someone who just has a good reputation for giving good advice and understanding issues and stuff like that. So they will say, oh, we don't have anyone particularly emotionally intelligent, but they do. And it's, maybe those are people that are doing hiring. You never know what role they've gotten themselves into. It might be a T&E lawyer, not a flashy lawyer, but someone who deals with people a lot. So yeah.
Yeah, I think just being very active with the ADR community and dispute resolution in general, I guess I'm exposed to a lot more folks that I would say have a high degree of emotional intelligence, because I think that's a good quality
Mm,
in a mediator, certainly,
for
and an
sure.
arbitrator as well. I guess, other practice areas or people that come from a background, an area of law that maybe doesn't value emotional intelligence as much as other areas. I do, those folks don't get exposed to it as much. Just, you mentioned this briefly a little earlier in our conversation here. You talk about raising the four components of emotional intelligence, and I'll repeat them again. It's emotional perception, emotional empathy, emotional understanding, and emotional regulation. Can you discuss what short circuiting is and the garbage in, garbage out philosophy? This kind of caught my eye as I was reading along. And why is it so important to understanding this as kind of the basis of disputes?
Well, the reason it's so important is if you think of these four major skills, and this is not any one theory, but it's sort of where the commonality on all theories of emotional intelligence are, is there's sort of four types of skills. And like I said, it's emotional perception or being able to identify the emotions at play, emotional empathy, which means that you can actually not sympathize with, but you can in yourself go back into those same feelings. It means feeling with. It doesn't mean sympathy. It means I know how you feel. That's a real component of emotional empathy. Then there's emotional regulation and emotional management. So those four skills, but the bottom of the pyramid is empathy and is emotional perception. And the reason that's so important is if you misidentify the emotion to start out with, if you say, oh, this person that's just walked into my office is feeling a lot of shame, a lot of shame. And so now what am I going to do about it? How do I have empathy with his situation? How do I help regulate? How do I manage our relationship? These other issues are all based on that initial analysis. And if that initial analysis is wrong, he or she's not feeling shame. They're feeling annoyance.
Mm.
They're angry. They're disgusted. I mean, there's a lot of potential for what someone might actually be feeling that you might misperceive, and that lawyers we know do misperceive. This is the thing they're worst at, is this bottom critical layer, so that you have misunderstandings of what's going on. And once that happens, then all of your analytical skills, which contribute to emotional regulation and emotional management, those profit from analytical skills. But if you can't feel, if you can't perceive the emotion at play, those analytical skills aren't going to help you. So it's a garbage in, garbage out scenario. That's why it's so critical. And not all lawyers are deficient in this, but this is the most common area that lawyers are deficient in.
So, thinking about how people become lawyers as a segue, how do law schools play a role in developing emotionally intelligent attorneys? And might some law schools actually be to blame for the lack of emotional intelligence that some attorneys display? Now, we've all seen the paper chase or TV shows and movies about training attorneys. I know certainly not my law school, which I felt was a very warm, embracing environment where students support each other and faculty supported students. But I've heard of other law schools where, you need some critical case in the case book in the library, and the student before you rips the page out just to trip you up in your class standing or something like that. Is law school where the problems start? Is law school a good place to train attorneys to be more emotionally intelligent?
Well, let's sort of go back to the beginning. And one of the things Peter Salovey, who became the president of Yale and was one of those three original researchers on emotional intelligence, one of the reasons he came to researching emotional intelligence is he found that in researching deductive reasoning, what made you better or worse at deductive reasoning, he used LSAT test questions to determine who was good at that. And what he found out was that the high scores on LSAT questions meant that you had a slightly depressed mood,
Hmm.
which meant that you had a tendency toward poor emotional regulation. So we're starting out with for the most part, a population of people who probably don't have the best emotional regulation skills and are toward depression.
Interesting.
So that's sort of a scary thought to start out with. And then you look at the emotional intelligence of lawyers as they go through law school, and it goes down over law school.
Hmm.
Unlike the emotional intelligence of doctors going through med school, where it tends to go up. So we have lawyers with some questionable emotional intelligence skills to start out with, law students to start out with. And then on top of that, that experience of law school tends to lower their emotional intelligence. And I mean, we see it in the statistics because lawyers come out with really high levels of depression, really high levels, 3 or 4 times the number, the ratio in the population. So that's discouraging. I mean, that's a problem to start out with. And then you have these very competitive scenarios. I mean, Yale Law School did a study not that long ago, maybe 4 years ago, and over 70% of their students regularly availed themselves of mental health counseling. So we know this is, for the most part, a very competitive, but you're starting out with people, as I'd like to, who may not have the best emotion regulation skills.
And we
And
know
then,
in the field as well that, and as you mentioned, high rates of depression, but also high rates of substance abuse and other issues that are
yes.
really much higher in the attorney community than others. But I cut you off. Continue.
No, that's true. Substance abuse, um, suicide, these both are probably related to some extent to the depression levels. Sort of self-medicating with substances and that sort of thing. So yeah, so what can law schools do? Well, we could have some sort of emotional intelligence screening or assessment. And again, some of that is definitely done in almost every business school in the United States. Some medical schools too. That's part of your submission, your application.
And it should be mentioned that when you apply to medical school, it's not just based on your GPA and your MCAT score. If you're invited to go to the next step in the application process, you do an interview. And I I don't, I mean, maybe a very tiny handful of law schools in the United States require an interview, but
Right.
I certainly didn't have any friends that went to law school that interviewed before.
No, I didn't either. Yeah. So there's that issue that it's not important enough to us to try to screen the way other professions do. Another issue is that our teachers, our professors, have not had any screening. There's a couple of law schools in Florida that pride themselves by having screened their professors. But, again, you have sort of counselors, professors, people who don't necessarily have these skills and maybe don't value them, who are sort of running the law school. So that would be something if there was more emphasis, and if there was just more emphasis, you were talking about you were in a fairly collegial law school, more emphasis on recognizing and rewarding cooperation, collegiality, teamwork, that sort of thing. And I know many law schools are trying to do this, trying to give more team-based assignments because they know how important it is to get along with other people, how important that is, that collaboration. There's been books out on how important collaboration is to lawyers specifically in the cross-selling and management and all sorts of areas, productivity. I
You know,
think
you
that's
mentioned, but the
essential.
team building activities, I mean, that's a big difference between obviously law school and business school. At some business schools, group work is the vast majority of the classes they take.
Right.
So it's interesting to me that law still doesn't necessarily value that as part of the training.
Many business schools have a like a leadership component to it where they assess you to make sure you understand how you impact the people you're leading and working with so that you grow over business school to be a better leader. We don't do that in law schools for the most part.
All right, while your book primarily discusses lawyering with emotional intelligence, since this podcast is primarily aimed at members of the ADR community, how can emotional intelligence benefit my mediation or arbitration practice, or both?
Yeah, so we were talking about negotiation, which there is an aspect of negotiation in obviously in both mediation and in arbitration. Um, and understanding your own biases and your own perceptions. We definitely know that our perceptions, our emotional state affects our perception. There's a great Israeli study that was done of parole judges, and people have probably heard about this, where all they're asked, they did 6-minute clips asking, reviewing, having somebody come in, review their petition, is their parole approved or not? And they did this for 8 hours. And they had 2 meal breaks in between during that period of time. And the average for all eight, there were 8 judges, for all of them was 35% were approved of those. So it sounds sort of like everybody was on the same page. But then when you looked at the details, they approved almost zero in the hour before a meal. And then they approved almost 100% in the hour after a meal.
Oh my gosh.
And then as the day wore on, it went down, down, down. Boredom, fatigue, hunger, these things, all they had to do was review a petition for parole and say yes or no. But across the board, those perceptions of what was fair or what was right changed
Yeah.
depending on their emotional state. So we don't, there's another really great study. They did it of college level professors. And they asked them, they manipulated their mood. So at one point, they read a group of essays when they were in a good mood, and then the same group of essays, although they didn't necessarily realize it, when they were in a negative mood, separated by time and space, but with their mood manipulated. There was almost a 2-letter grade difference in worse when they were in a negative mood than when they were in a positive mood. So you hope your professor's in a good mood when they're reading your papers.
I was just going to say, I'm glad whoever read the essay section of my bar exam was in a good mood when they were reading through it, because then I might not be an attorney had they been in a bad
That's
mood.
right. That's right.
It's funny you mentioned that, because getting back to the food aspect and being in a good mood, if you know, at a lot of AAA offices, GM's offices, etc., when you come for, let's say, a mediation, they feed you, right? These ADR providers, and they have, you know, they don't want you to be hungry through the process. Nice chairs, nice t negotiation environment, whatnot, to keep everybody focused on the task at hand, but also keep everybody in a positive mood to hopefully reach resolution. So it's
Right.
kind of the food thing really stuck out to me. I joked I worked at an ADR provider where I probably gained 15 pounds in the first year that I worked there, because there was always so much food laying around. But
Well, it makes sense. So you want to so there's the perceptions of the clients, and then there's the perceptions of the the negotiators, the mediator, the arbitrator, whoever it is that's doing this. Perceptions change based on emotion. And what we've learned is that it's very important, and this may not come naturally it's very important for emotions in the room to be identified out loud. So first of all, you have the perception problem. Can you perceive what's going on emotionally? Then, but secondly, if you can, and if you can identify it out loud, Gee, Mr. X, I see that are you very angry? Can you tell me why you're angry? Or, gee, Mr. So I can see that you've been very embarrassed by this. Or can you tell me how you feel about it? Making sure those emotions are identified and spoken, because naming the emotion quells the amygdala activity. Amygdala is where the emotional stuff is going on, where people house their emotional reactions. So if you can name it, it will help quell that activity, and you've taken a step already by naming it. Then there's a lot of negotiators, mediators who believe you should start with a positive emotions. Some people disagree with it, but a number of mediators say you should start with positive emotions and try to build that. And if you need to, you go into anger and stuff, but you should start with positive. And its reasons, it's part of the reason is your relationship with the other negotiator, or the other, if there is another negotiator, or if there, it's not so true of obviously mediators or arbitrators, but learning how to start with a positive and then moving into a more negative if you have to do that. Understanding your own relationship with success. Uh, what is success? What does it mean to you personally? Can you accept their definition of success? Maybe if somebody just wants an apology, can you let that be the success?
And we talk about all the time, like when I teach mediation advocacy courses,
Oh,
the power of an apology, right?
yes.
Everybody thinks it's about a dollar figure. It's about
Mhm.
money. It's about what do I get? For some people, that apology has an infinite value monetarily, getting somebody to
Absolutely.
admit they were wrong and to apologize for
Or sometimes they want to maintain or they want to define a better business relationship. They don't want to lose the relationship.
it, right?
They want to be able to define a way of working together. So you're quite right. An apology is such a powerful thing, but not everybody is open to that as seeing that as a success.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the book?
Well, there's a lot of stuff. But there's a few things.
Yeah.
Generational trauma. I don't know if people are aware of how much, again, this is self-awareness. There may be a lot in your emotional backpack that you don't have any awareness over about because it happened 2 generations ago. And that's definitely a case that emotional trauma goes generationally. And there's a lot of studies, and I won't go into all of them, about how fascinating it is that something that happened to your grandmother may trigger you and you don't know. So that's where some of the awareness has to come around. What triggers me? What's my reaction, and why is that? And maybe that's not so smart. The other thing, of course, is AI and emotional intelligence. I know that's something you have an interest in.
Yep.
I am of the opinion that AI is going to take over a lot of the lower level, facilitating more advanced legal work, but I'm strongly of the opinion that we do not have artificial emotional intelligence, and that emotional intelligence is what the humans bring to the interaction and what people need. They need someone who's sympathetic, who says they understand, who says they're looking out for them. So I think that's going to be very important.
Yep.
I guess those two are the two. I would also point out that the data we have is that there is no difference racially in emotional intelligence levels. There doesn't seem to be much difference in genders, although I'm always asked that. What we do find is there tends to be a little higher levels of emotional empathy amongst women and a little higher levels of emotional management amongst men. The problem for women is that emotional empathy can sometimes be sort of the dumping grounds in organizations where people come to them with their emotional problems, and it's not that they come to them, it's that the women can't put boundaries around that well enough to protect themselves. But it's a fascinating subject, and there's a whole lot more topics covered in the book.
Rhonda, this has been a great discussion. How can our listeners reach you with questions or comments? You want to direct them to a website or an email address or whatnot?
Yeah, I have a blog, a lot of people management blog. Happy to see you there. I posted something just the other day on AI and CEOs and making artificially intelligent CEOs. My email address is lawpeoplemanagement01@gmail.com. I'm happy to hear from anybody.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Rhonda, for your time, and everybody go pick up Rhonda's book.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you for joining us on Resolutions. Today's episode has illuminated the powerful impact of effective dispute resolution and showcased the incredible individuals who dedicate themselves to this important work. Our mission is to explore the diverse world of dispute resolution, and we hope we've inspired you to engage with conflict and collaboration in new ways. If you're not yet a member of the ABA section of dispute resolution, we invite you to join our community of professionals making a difference. Your involvement can help us build a more harmonious society together. And if you found value in our conversations, please consider leaving us a review and a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more people and continue our journey towards excellence in dispute resolution. Until next time, keep solving problems, building bridges, and creating positive changes in your communities.